This lecture will look at contemporary gaming in the new millennium with the rise of Xbox and the most popular console in history, the PS2. Now, Sega at this time has already had two failed hardware releases with the Mega CD and the 32X. This is going to mean that when they release the Saturn, it would be steamrolled by Sony, given the confidence that they had with the consumer base was already shaken. Now we're going to enter the sixth generation of home console launches with the Dreamcast, Xbox, and PlayStation 2. The first of these to be released would be the Sega Dreamcast. The origins of this console go back to 1996 when Bernie Stolar, who was at the time Sega of America president coming over from PlayStation, and the president of Sega of Japan, Irimajiri, both agreed that the Saturn had failed and are going to set two teams tasked with creating a new console, one in America and one in Japan. The American team had hardware that used a graphics processor made by 3DFX, but unbeknownst to Sega at the time, they would release their own home console, so that idea would be abandoned. At the same time, Hideki Sato, who was leading the Japanese team, was the one selected for obvious reasons, and he has been working on a forward-thinking console with a built-in 56K modem that would connect to online gaming portals, such as Sega Net, the first of its kind, later to be followed by examples like Xbox Live we'll talk about. The Dreamcast, as designed by Sato, used a proprietary GD-ROM, known for, or otherwise known as, a gigabyte disk read-only memory. Now, this proprietary software allowed them to create visuals that were truly a leap beyond and defeated the PlayStation on all fronts. Now, knowing and being very conscious of the fact that Sega's reputation has been damaged given two failed hardware launches, they decided to minimize the associations with Sega and named the unit instead Dreamcast, with an orange swirl logo symbolizing, as Sato would say, the universe and the infinite power of human beings. Now, this would be waylaid by the Japanese launch because there was a shortage of NEC chipsets, and they were in limited stock, and so it sold out very quickly due to high demand. Now, unfortunately, there was a poor lineup originally for the Dreamcast, except for Sonic Adventure, which had been designed in 1998. Now, Sonic Adventure saw the return of the infamous Sonic team after their disastrous abandonment of the Sonic Extreme project. So Yuji Naka again would return to his Blue Hedgehog. Now, it was not as complex a game as Super Mario 64, but it was fast and visually gorgeous and packed with spectacular sequences. One of the most notable ones that people remember would be when Sonic speeds across a rickety platform atop of the ocean in the very first level, and we find that the camera is going to pan behind him, showing a giant killer whale destroying the track behind. Another example of a hit in Japan, at least, would be Yut Saito's Seaman of 1999, and this would indicate the original direction that Sega would take its software development. Now, Saito at the time knew and built this idea on the contemporary craze for Tamagotchi, or virtual pets that people would take care of, feed, watch them sleep, etc. Therefore, he developed with Seaman a life simulator. Now, this life simulator would have a man's face on the body of a fish, and it would use a pack-in microphone that would allow players to talk to this man-fish and hold very meaningful, entertaining conversations with this bizarre and odd creature. Due to the damaged reputation of Sega in Japan, it had a relatively poor performance there, but that did not matter to Sega, for the audience was still disenfranchised and they knew it from Saturn's abandonment. The real target, as with last time with the Sega Genesis launch, was the American market, which was very lucrative. Now, Sega had learned its lesson in that consumers wanted quality and quantity in their launch of software. So they wanted many good choices of options that were high quality in all the genres. Therefore, Sega made sure to launch the Dreamcast in 1999 with 17 titles that would include Sonic Adventure, already mentioned, Soul Calibur, seen on the left, and Hydro Thunder, seen on the right. These would hit every target with recognizable characters, i.e. Sonic, sports games, beat-em-ups such as Soul Calibur, racers such as Hydro Thunder, and more. It worked at first. There was a huge launch in 1999, accompanied by a huge marketing blitz. They sold over 225,000 units in the first 24 hours alone. After 2 months, they would sell 1 million. Now, the way it launched was also new and was the model for PlayStation 4 and Xbox One, in which they had a campaign known as 9999. Thus, of course, it would be launched on this date and encourage pre-orders. So just as when PlayStation 4 and Xbox One would launch with customers lining up for hours and hours, this was the origin of this type of pre-order system. In order to capitalize on this momentum, Sega would reorganize its development staff into 9 autonomous second-party developers, and they allowed creative freedom in these developers in hopes of a surprise hit. Now, the developers at this time are at their peak, and we have many brilliant and original titles. One that focused solely on audio and is living out a Technicolor dream is going to relate the travails and the stories of Ulala on High Space Cats, where she would investigate rumors that aliens had captured humans and forced them to dance. The mechanics of the game are quite simple. It operates the same way Simon Says does. Ulala would automatically walk through various locations, and the player would not have control, and she would then pause for a dance-off with various enemies, who would then perform moves that she must then repeat, left, right, up, down, etc. Now, the vibrant setting and the funky tunes combined with a simple input allowed the game to be all about rhythm. Thus, you have an immersion glossing over the core mechanic simplicity. And there will be other examples following it that will take this to its logical synesthetic conclusion. One of those would be the game Rez, developed by United Game Artists and released in 2001. Now, based on similar principles of synesthesia, or whereby you will have one sense affected by or confused for another. The greatest example here is seeing sound or seeing colors or tasting colors. So this furthered the idea by combining it with an on-rails shooter, where you are going to have the player triggering rhythm and abstract visuals. Now, you pilot a craft moving at a constant speed while enemies pop up in the surrounding environment. You would target them in groups before releasing a shot. When they would be hit, various sound effects that would be appropriate to the stage's backing track play would then follow. Now, what is interesting about Rez is that as you play and you get better, the game itself looks and sounds better. Therefore, the reward is not a high score, but instead an audio-visual feedback loop that enhances the experience in line with your own sense of the beat and mastery of the levels. A very unique concept. It still remains a singular title for this originality. We have not seen this type of idea exploited again. Another example of these original titles in a game that sounds rather dull would be from Hitmaker Studio and is called Crazy Taxi, released in 1999. Now, the game is set in a large city where the player would pick up customers and drive them around as a taxi driver to various locations. Now, this sounds again incredibly dull, but the city is in fact filled with ramps, curves, oncoming traffic, and you have to make insane jumps, which makes the game quite thrilling. Now, a strict timer also forces the player to drive faster and thus enjoy the complexity of the mechanics even more. The most inspired touch in this example is the soundtrack by punk rock bands Bad Religion and The Offspring that, when conflated with the visuals, perfectly align to create a high-octane driving experience. The next example that we have from Hitmaker would be Virtua Tennis, launched in 1999. Now, even though there would be various sequels of this new franchise, this remains the best simulation of the sport of tennis available. Because it is, on the one hand, simple to play in an instant, but with the depth that we have here of the mechanics that mirror the real game's considerations, it has a wonderful feel. An example of this would be, in playing tennis, the most important part of returning the ball is how long your player is in the correct position, and that you are able to set yourself results in a powerful return in the desired direction and type of shot desired, whether you want to make a topspin, a lob, or any other. While Virtua Tennis would prove to be a wonderful sport release for the Dreamcast, Yuji Naka and his team were also developing Phantasy Star Online, released in 2000. Now, there are few titles, even though they launched the Dreamcast with the ability to play online, very few of the titles actually exploited this online connectivity. The most important of these would be Phantasy Star, which was a massively multiplayer online game, or MMOG, or MOG. Now, this is the future of real-time combat that we will see here, and will develop into games like Halo. Now, the communication allowed here was quite genius, because you could play with anyone in the world thanks to a symbol-based system instead of a linguistic one. And therefore, this allowing you to play with someone in Japan or Germany or Russia, did not matter what language you spoke, was also made even better by the lovely loot you could collect. It was inspired, in fact, by Blizzard's Diablo series, focusing on teamwork to bring down huge bosses in these bite-sized worlds. Players who would level up over time would find difficulty increasing in increments up to very hard, ensuring that there was a great deal of replay possible with this online multiplayer game. Now, the future of real-time combat can be seen here, and once again, the symbol-based system is very significant. Now, there are two final examples that illustrate the twin poles of Sega's ambition and style. The first we'll discuss was by Smilebit, and was Jet Set Radio, released in 2001. It pioneered the use of cell shading, which we will talk about quite a bit in this class, whereby characters are flat colored and surrounded by thin black outlines. This creates a visually beautiful, cartoony quality to the game, which is rejecting the wider industry move towards realistic games. Now, the player is cast as various members of Gigi's gang in a dystopian Tokyo future, where the object of the game is merely to roller skate around an urban environment and tag walls with graffiti. Now, the game, of course, since there are not enemies or other types of antagonists in the game, is about the simple pleasure of momentum and gradually unfolding the complexity of the environments. Now, you can traverse these environments by grinding along rails, making huge jumps, or hanging onto the backs of cars. Or you can simply speed along on your own skates. The original soundtrack was actually by Nagamuna here, and fed the game's theme named Jet Set Radio, which is a private radio station that provides the narrative. Now, outside of the game's objectives is the pleasure of moving through the stunt-happy architecture of Tokyoto, as it's called. It is, in fact, a peerless experience for the type of game it is. Now, on the opposite end of the spectrum as Jet Set Radio, we have Yu Suzuki's Shenmue of 1999, one of the most important game titles ever released for many reasons. Now, since the 1980s, Yu Suzuki had been Sega's star designer, creating games such as Outrun, Space Harrier, and Virtua Fighter. He worked on Virtua Fighter RPG, which would allow the player to control a series of protagonists named Akira in a 3D world with traditional RPG systems. Now, with the halt and collapse of Saturn, development also stopped with this new RPG fighter. He would return to his initial idea in The Old Man and the Peach Tree, which would then be renamed and reborn as Shenmue. Now we find that Shenmue is more of a domestic setting than the other games we've discussed, focusing on evolving the traditional role-playing experience towards something more immersive and responsive for players. One of the most expensive games ever made, with a budget of $47 million, we find that Shenmue has very ambitious by recreating an entire Tokyo suburb of Yokosuka with visually breathtaking and dynamic visuals. Now, the NPCs, or non-player characters, would go about their day muttering to themselves. Importantly, the weather changes over the course of the game and of the day, and the game would unfold over a series of months, with the main character, Ryo, going to bed every night in the same place. Thus, it develops this type of rhythm. In order to describe this new type of game, Suzuki coined the term free, which of course refers to full reactive eyes entertainment. Now, it had a special quality of the game, leading to this new neologism or new term, because of how much interactive detail was included. Now, the game is played in a non-linear environment, so the player can explore this area with Ryo at their leisure, and it is packed with things to find and distractions to be had. A great example of this is he comes upon an arcade full of playable versions of Sega classics. Now, the story ostensibly is a revenge narrative whereby he's trying to find his father's killer, but it's really an ode to mundanity and of the mundane, in other words. It captures the experience of living in a small town, for the days always begin the same way. The streets start to become familiar, and strangers eventually become your friends. So you must work out how to pass the time, and this is really the submerged goal in Shenmue, is all of these other activities, not solving a murder, not going about high-octane action, but in what it's like living in this environment. Now, there are moments of drudgery, but they're counterpointed with rare high-octane action sequences when he gets into fights or drives his motorcycle. So it is quite ambitious if you think about what Suzuki's team did. For because it is set in Yokosuka in 1986, the team researched weather reports to accurately model the virtual world's weather in order to reflect it. It is the first game as well where every single non-player character NPC was fully voice acted. So stalking them becomes a minor obsession as you want to learn more about them and their background. Now, there's also a traditional conflict here between youth and conservatism, for the main character Ryo dresses in stereotypical Western garb of jeans and a jacket, whereby the elders have more traditional Japanese attire. Now, again, as we mentioned, this is set up as a revenge story, trying to find his father's killer, but he never does throughout the entire game. Instead, we have a series of vignettes about mourning and loss as he drifts from job to job and place to place. Now, it was intended to be a trilogy, but Dreamcast production was canceled, and so it never did come about that Shenmue 3 would ever be made. But it did showcase a new way of creating interactive worlds and giving meaning to characters' personalities. Shenmue was also the last great game that Sega released as a console manufacturer. It was overly ambitious for its expense, and they were blind to market realities when they launched it. It, of course, never recouped what it cost. And we find that Sega at this time was also unable to compete with the more traditional interactive entertainment of its competitors in Nintendo and Sony at the time. But what made Sega special was exactly what made Shenmue and these other titles special. Its originality, its high quality, and its visionary recasting of existing genres in new ways. Sony at this time also announced the PlayStation 2 well before its release, intending to undercut the release of the Dreamcast. Therefore, consumers wound up waiting instead of buying the Dreamcast, knowing the PlayStation 2 would come. This, coupled with the fact that Sega's games weren't as commercially viable, led to the collapse of Sega as a console manufacturer. Therefore, Sega was now halting all production on the Dreamcast and any future consoles, and was restructured as a third-party software developer, making games for other companies. At the same time, Sony was preparing to release the best-selling console in history, the second sixth-generation console after the Dreamcast, cementing Sony's position. Now, at 155 million units sold, this would become the best-selling console of all time. Now, this was partly made possible thanks to Sony's wise strategy of having a wide and deep library of options. So we found that Sony would develop 3,874 games to be available for the PlayStation 2. It was also backwards compatible with the PSX or PS1, so people who already owned PlayStation games could still play them. Now, Sony at this time had two major advantages. It had the PlayStation brand, which had become synonymous with gaming as Nintendo had been in the 1980s. And secondly, the drive to maintain the volume it had of third-party support, so it would always have more games than the competition. Therefore, Nintendo and Sega relied heavily, we see, on first-party software because that made up most of their sales, such as with Nintendo and Sonic, instead of having more open and wide relationships with other developers. At $299, we find that the PlayStation 2 doubled as a DVD player. And in the year 2000, this would make it the cheapest DVD player on the market. Not to mention, it's also the best console. Now, the important features which made it the best and cemented its legacy would be, number one, it was backwards compatible. You could still play PlayStation 1 games on it. It had a USB port that allowed for expansion later in its life and a range of peripherals such as the PlayStation Eye, microphones, trackball, mouse, and anything else that you could plug into with a USB port. Therefore, when the competition did arrive a year later in 2001, the PS2 was ready with exclusive titles such as Grand Theft Auto 3 and Metal Gear Solid 2. In fact, it's surprising, looking back at the history of consoles, that the Xbox ever launched at all. The story of the Xbox goes back to 4 Microsoft employees and a PowerPoint where they presented the idea that Microsoft should get involved with video game consoles. That would be Kevin Backus, Seamus Blackley, Ted Hayes, and Otto Burkus. Now, these employees would argue that Microsoft, the largest tech company in the world, had every right and ability to create a home console system. They, in fact, already had a games division for home computers or PCs. Now, Bill Gates himself would push back the release of the Xbox to 2001 to ensure that it could outperform the PS2, as he announced it at the Game Developer Conference, or GDC. So here in 2000, where he announced the release of the Xbox, he stated that the console would be superior in every way, in terms of raw power especially, with 65 megabits of DRAM to PS2's 40. 150 million polygons were possible to see on screen per second, whereas the PS2 had only 66. And there was, Finally, it had 233 megahertz of processing power for this GPU versus the PS2's 150. So all in all, what Bill Gates is saying is that in terms of processing power and the capabilities, the Xbox far outstrips the PS2 in every category. Now, that does not mean, however, the Xbox would necessarily be successful because of the reputation that Sony had and the fact that they had such a broad library of offerings. But another thing that Microsoft did, which was rather smart with the Xbox, is have a placeholder here, which was the Xbox as a name, and which originally was short for Direct Xbox. They believed that marketing would come along and come up with something better, and they did come up with Microsoft 11X. They happened to also leave Xbox on the focus testing to prove that consumers would not like it, but consistently consumers noted that was one of their top choices, and so Microsoft just decided to go with their original placeholder name, Xbox. The Sega of America vice president, of course, Charles Belfield, very famously, when talking about how the Dreamcast failed and Sega had to get out of the console business, noted rather pejoratively that the Xbox was an ugly motherfucker, which it was, because the hardware that was used to make it was quite ugly, because they used standardized PC components, with the internals being much more bulky than its competitors. Now, it was the first to have a hard drive, which was very important. It also had an Ethernet port and a front-loading disk drive, all of which made it enormous as a console. And the pad also did not help. This controller, which was nicknamed the Fatty or the Duke, because the size of it was about a dinner plate, it would later be replaced by the S controller for the Japanese launch, and then after that, because of the popularity, globally replacing the Duke. Now, even though they had a more powerful console, Microsoft was going to hedge its bets when it came to software and the launch. They bought outright the studio Bungie, which developed the first-person shooter Halo Combat Evolved in 2001. Now, whereas GoldenEye 007 showed how consoles could play host to first-person shooters successfully, Halo was the next step in this evolution. Now you did not need to have a PC to enjoy first-person shooters. Now, this is a new idea that was brought to the genre and instituted many things that hereafter would become the industry standard. Now, first, the main character, named Master Chief, was only allowed to carry 2 weapons at a time, and he has a shield that absorbs damage and regenerates over time in lieu of a fixed health bar. Now, it is special due to the fact that the enemies and the environments are so unique. Now, whereas the environments can be tight corridors or sprawling landscapes, we find that vehicles as well provide us with a huge sense of scale in this game, in this universe. The Warthog Jeep, found nearly ubiquitously all over the game, was hugely satisfying to control, with a high top speed, a weighty feel, and boasting a back-mounted cannon that either the player as Master Chief or a Marine could fire. This Warthog could plow through enemies. The Marines in the game also played an important part of the atmosphere, for their excitement at seeing Master Chief arrive to help them is a great a boost to a player's ego. The enemies, known as the Covenant, were also sleek, vividly colored aliens that worked together. Now, you would find that if you took out one of their captains, the group would panic and run. The difficulty levels as well were unique in Halo. Rather than simply increasing enemy damage as the game progressed along with health points, we find that would make the character work together more effectively. Here, dying in the first-person shooter is not new, but feeling outsmarted by an AI opponent is. Therefore, Halo Combat Evolved was such a touchstone that future first-person shooters would be called Halo clones, or if they were highly anticipated and thought that they would be rather good, Halo killers. Therefore, Xbox had its iconic game from day one, cementing it in the console wars, once again in the 6th generation. While the Xbox was releasing, we find also that Nintendo was trying to get back into the home console game with its GameCube. Now, PlayStation had relegated the once leader of the industry to a supporting role. Therefore, we find that Nintendo saw this early on and started the N64 or Nintendo 64 successor in 1997, codenamed Project Dolphin. The GameCube would be Nintendo's answer to the Xbox and the PS2 as its 6th generation console. Now, cost for Nintendo was always a primary concern, so thanks to the early start, it was able to produce hardware that was arguably able to outperform the PS2 at a lower price. Now, they realized, very importantly, that they had alienated third parties in the past with their rather strict draconian licensing. Therefore, Nintendo made the console specifically so it's easy to develop for. They learned from PlayStation, and now it had a simple, clean architecture with a library of technical features. It also used mini DVDs, so storage would not be a problem as it had been with the cartridges in the N64. It was also beautiful compared to the Xbox. It was light and compact with an adorable carrying handle on the rear. The pad was also extraordinarily comfortable, with a gorgeous smooth left analog stick, a giant A button, which is the most used button, a stubby right analog stick, and a very strange Z button that almost no games use, the trigger button. The first Nintendo console here, importantly, launched without a Mario title. Instead, it came with Luigi's Mansion, a strange hybrid of exploring and a ghost story. The story in this particular launch would be that Luigi, the less famous brother of Mario, needed to find his brother by hoovering up ghosts. It is lean in this instance, but the quality lineup that Nintendo had was good, for it did also launch with Wave Racer and Monkey Ball. The PS2 and Xbox, importantly, sold for $299 each, so they were comparable and competing directly against one another. On the other hand, the GameCube was $100 less at $199, and this is important to note. Therefore, as Microsoft hemorrhaged money trying to make Xbox a success, Sega would be mortally wounded by hardware price cuts and cut its losses with the Dreamcast. At the same time, Nintendo would hold on in these lean years before we get to the Wii series through a blindingly simple tactic. They always sold hardware at a profit. PlayStation now faced a new entrant into the game, that being Xbox and Microsoft, and thus a new revitalized competitor with Nintendo and its GameCube. So, in turn, they cut the price of their PS2 from $299 to $199 to match the GameCube. Therefore, GameCube and Xbox both had successful launches, but the PS2's momentum was relentless for one important reason. It had 3,900 games developed for the PS2, 1,000 for the Xbox, and 600 for the GameCube. Therefore, Sony outstripped its competition immeasurably when it came to selection and choice that players had. It had the richest library, in fact, of any individual console in history. Among this varied and diverse library was the minimalist masterpiece designed and directed by Fumito Ueda, Ico of 2001, which was a third-person adventure inspired by Eric Chahai's cinematic platformer Another World. The story is actually involving a boy and a girl, Ico and Yorda, who are trapped in a large castle as they try to escape, with brief sections of the narrative shown through subtitled cutscenes. It is in fact a reaction against the ever-present trend to pile as much stuff as you can into a game, and was pared back as much as possible. Therefore, there is no heads-up display or HUD, and it had a very limited mechanic associated with it. It even favored ambient sound effects over music in most scenes. It is the only great game built around an escort mission, in fact, and the only example that successfully uses interaction to tell a story of a relationship. Ico, at the outset, finds Yorda trapped in a cage and frees her, taking her hand while running around environments. Now, at the same time that he could help Yorda climb and catch her from falling, she also in turn could help him traverse obstacles and do things he would not be able to do on his own. It has gorgeously fluid animations and captures the exertion and determination of these children, while also emphasizing how they cling to each other in this intimidating place. In its simplest terms, you could say that Ico is a game about a boy and a girl holding hands, but the story and the characters are never fully fleshed out. The game's narrative, in fact, gathers incredible force because the player lives the experience through controlling the character of Ico. The environments as well are going to add this type of atmosphere as they reflect Ico's inner mood. When separated from Yorda, for instance, the castle's materials will change from stone into metal, and the color, to complement this, becomes muted. It is a technological feat as well, for it is one of the first games to use bloom lighting, keyframe animation, and complex cloth dynamics in conjunction with inverse kinematics, which ensure that the character's feet are always positioned correctly on steps. Sadly, Eco was not a commercial success, as you might have guessed. It was recognized later as one of the most important games of the era. Therefore, with the next title, the Eco team spent 4 years ensuring that it would be a commercial success and also push the envelope of game design and development. Now here we have Fumito Ueda's team again and the Shadow of the Colossus of 2005. It had Eco's aesthetic and improved upon it with many technical innovations, but it was an utterly distinct experience. Learning from their commercial failure with Eco, the team now focused more on action-oriented themes, and it is one of the best and most unusual action games ever made. It is based around the premise or this unique idea asking the question, what if a game had no normal enemies and just boss fights? The character that you play is named Wander and rides around on his horse Argo across a long bridge in the opening scene leading to a temple. There is a dead woman draped on the back of the horse. He leaves her in the temple and makes a deal with the demon living there, Dormammu, to resurrect her in exchange for destroying 16 colossi, or these individual colossus that inhabit this world. It is a simple yet effective rhythm in playing Shadow of the Colossus because it alternates between riding across desolate landscapes and then fighting these colossi, or an individual colossus. The colossi are enormous and range in sizes and have very few things in common. Some are going to be found on open ground, others in tight spaces. Some fly, others live underwater. Some are hundreds of times larger than the main character, others are only slightly bigger. Now, the colossi require different tactics to battle them, so it is never as simple as picking up and swinging a sword. For instance, you might have to climb up one and investigate where the weak spot is to hit, while the giant attempts to shake you off. The desert colossus, for instance, is a huge flying beast that occasionally dips its wings in the sand. Therefore, you have to figure out that you need to ride Argo, your horse, at full speed, correctly judging exactly when the angle of the wings come low enough to jump on the beast. Once you're on this massive colossus, it realizes it and turns upside down. Therefore, you either fall off or have to hang on with a single hand, eventually pulling yourself up and inching towards its head. Equally important for the Shadow of the Colossus is your horse Argo. Now, in other games, once a player is in the saddle, you instantly take control of the horse. Here, on the other hand, the player controls Wander, and he then, this character, pulls the reins to the left or right. Now, you find there's a slight delay then on the horse responding. So it is very effective at making Argo feel like a real animal with its own personality. Now, Eco and Shadow here are very different games, but they are complementary titles. We should state that the first is about companionship and innocence, while the latter is about what leads up to this. Now, as the game progresses, it becomes clear that the character is paying a toll, and this theme, even though it is not overt and explicit, is sacrifice and the consequences thereof. Both games' impact, importantly, comes from not from anything explicit that the game tells you or that it states, but instead from the experience of the journey, a very well thought out premise. Switching gears to a much more commercially viable genre that becomes popular, the third-person brawler. One of the best examples of that by Kamiya is going to be Devil May Cry of 2001. Now, this particular genre bloomed in the 6th generation of hardware and focused on dynamic hand-to-hand combat against groups of enemies, and this was pioneered in the third-person brawler. It started in Devil May Cry here as a prototype for the new Resident Evil. but it introduced something new and spun off its own series of games as well. It introduced a combo-heavy style of playing where you would brawl that would rate players on how stylishly they could execute long strings of moves, and that would offer also stiff challenges. The only drawback to Devil May Cry is that it used a fixed camera in 3D environments. Therefore, you didn't always have the best view of the action as seen here in the upper left. Another example and development in this type of genre comes from Beautiful Joe, which is Kamiya's next project, which was a side-scrolling brawling adaptation with these mechanics. But it was built entirely around the camera this time as a concept and a mechanic. The camera is fixed on one plane to observe the world. Therefore, you're not following behind the character's shoulder, for instance, or far off. When Joe jumps, the camera doesn't jump. Instead, it jerks upwards like an audience member's gaze. When Joe turns corners, in fact, the camera stays fixed on him. Therefore, the environment itself rotates. It has a very radical visual style that puts the player in the role of observer and participant simultaneously. Now, Joe's abilities are also tied to the camera. Therefore, in the slow-mo or speeding up or zooming in, all of these affect the behavior of the enemies and increase the impact of Joe's fists or feet and what he's doing. This gives the player a flexible moveset, an opportunity to control and direct the performance, like you're creating your own action movie. Because of the sheer quantity of these brawlers and these games in this genre, a brief overview is required instead of an in-depth analysis. A few of these that we should note would be 2003's Ninja Gaiden, which stands alone for its unforgiving enemies and tight patterns of attack, block, and counter. Defense in Ninja Gaiden is as important as offense. Now, the only secret to combat here is fluid, swift interchange. More so than any other game, Ninja Gaiden would manhandle the player. Therefore, it was more rewarding once you master the series of attack, block, counter moves. And so you have a much more satisfying experience. We find that Devil May Cry 3 in 2005 gave the lead character Dante an upgrade with 5 weapons, 5 sidearms, and 6 fighting styles. This challenged the player to build their own way of fighting from a dizzying array of possibilities and combinations. It is a brilliant core system here that lets players stretch the mechanics to its limits. Every increase in strength is also matched by further possibilities. Therefore, you're never really finished playing because of how many possibilities there are here with various fighting styles and the weapons. On the other side of the spectrum of these brawlers would be a reaction against this style in The God of War, released in 2005. Now, this focused instead on the spectacle of Kratos, destroying Olympian deities one by one in ancient Greece. It is visually stunning as a game with so many bosses and such a monumental scale associated with them never seen before. It is inspiring to watch in motion. It also made the combat system basic. It kept the difficulty down to open up the genre to players less inclined to master these complicated combinations of moves. It also is the most commercially successful example of the brawler genre, with many sequels. You have the God of War 1, 2, and 3, and then Ascension. The last title from Capcom's Clover Studio is also another one of these very important brawlers that converted a 2D brawler into a 3D system and environment, and that would be Mikami's God Hand of 2006. And it is a system built for one-on-one fighting. The game is built around Gene, the God Hand himself, as it transitions between him as a cocksure guy swaying through these scenes and martial arts styles. Now, we switch the nature of the inputs here by allowing you to assign a string of attacks to pressing a single button repeatedly. You could pin others and once again spare face buttons. Fighting was no longer about memorizing button combos, but now timing. Dodging attacks and being beautifully elegant, we now have the ability for the character to have these head bobs, side steps, back flips that were mapped to these whips of the right analog stick. The most telling fact as far as the controls are concerned is that there's a button solely dedicated to taunting one's enemies. Now, there are many innovations in God Hand. We find that it is a dynamic in its difficulty as far as the system is concerned. The game, importantly, gets harder as you fight better, but then if you start losing, it becomes easier. So it automatically adjusts depending upon how you're doing, instead of being locked into a difficulty setting throughout the entire course of the game. Now, this game here focuses on what really matters to the player to the exclusion of everything else. It gives the body to things that are ridiculous in 2D games and emphasizes the various grotesqueries. There are armies of enemies with physically huge bosses. There are oversized weapons that are critical to the vocabulary as seen in the upper right. You do ridiculous things that stretch the game to the limit, such as wrestling giant apes, dwarf Power Rangers, or kicking Elvis in the nuts, spanking a dominatrix that's a karate master. Anything in the game goes, and it is hands down the best single-player fighter in gaming history, and also the funniest. For instance, the shot between the levels where Gene would level up and gain more weapons and ammunition and armor is called barely regal. There are certain enemies, for instance, that scream Mike Tyson quotes for no reason. Shifting gears again back to Resident Evil, Mikami would return to the series, which became stale by Resident Evil 3. He would revitalize this series with a departure from the survival horror game towards one solely interested in survival. And it would also emphasize the combat mechanics, introducing an over-the-shoulder view, a third-person perspective that became the genre standard from this point on. He also abandoned fixed camera angles, fetch quests, and even zombies, starting fresh with the franchise. The environments are fully 3D, but combat here had a greater range of possibilities. Location-specific damage, for instance, such as shooting enemies in the knees, would be combined with contextual moves like roundhouse kicks. Now, this ties into new enemies who are semi-intelligent, the Ganados, who try to mob the main character, Leon S. Kennedy, every chance they get. And this is core to the combat, much more akin to crowd control than one-on-one brawling. The Ganados talk to each other and shout at Leon, try to blindside him by stepping outside of his vision. And this is a brilliant touch, that Leon can counter this by staggering the Ganados and executing kicks or throws, which would grant him a brief second of invulnerability during the moves and clear space. Ostensibly, the game is about rescuing the president's kidnapped daughter, but in a twist, she, Ashley, is rescued early in the game. The rest of the game is spent protecting her. This becomes another variable in combat, for she becomes a target of the Ganados who would try to carry her off. This also stops the player from dashing past enemies or abandoning certain positions because you would lose her. The craftsmanship in Resident Evil 4 is astonishing and matched only by its grisly imagination that never stops. Examples include Del Lago, a monstrous fish that you harpoon from a speedboat seen on the right, or El Gigantes, who batters you into the walls and off the grounds. There's a giant statue of a dwarf that chases you into the waiting arms of the real thing. There's no single moment in Resident Evil 4, just the sheer overwhelming number of them. You would remember an angry mob inside a cabin, entering a castle by cannoning down the gate, dodging boulders, riding a minecart, hiding from a half-scorpion mentalist seen here. Every element is polished much more than it needs to be. The inventory system, for instance, is also a puzzle game in disguise. The main character shivers without a jacket when he's outside, and on Mercenaries mode, which is unlocked after beating it, is so successful that it becomes a standalone title in and of itself. This set a new standard for third-person action games and influenced everyone since. Its influence has never waned. Now, what's interesting is Nintendo actually had the exclusive for a period for Resident Evil 4, and it was one of the few party highlights that it had. But the software library depended on first and second-hand party games, and quality remained high in these, but Nintendo was still worried, threatened by the success of PlayStation and Xbox. Now this can be seen, their worry that is, in two central franchises of Mario and Zelda. We find Mario Sunshine here of 2002 fell very short of it as being a successor to Super Mario 64. Now Mario in this game wears a water spraying device called a flood, which allows him to hover in the air for a spell, mitigating the difficulty of judging jumps in 3D. There are several worlds that are good, but strangely unsatisfying with minor annoyances. The Il Delfino, for instance, is an uninspired knockoff compared to Peach's Castle. Equally unsatisfying would be the series addition to Zelda, The Legend of Zelda The Wind Waker of 2002. Now, this one can be forgiven for its gorgeous cell shading and its take on the series. For the player here controls the child Link, rendered as a cartoon character with big eyes, set on a great ocean with the deepest blue color you've seen, dotted with various islands. Link has a boat to sail and can control the direction of the wind in the game. It captures more of the spirit of exploration from the original Zelda, but there were issues. Some of these issues that bring it down include that the game, much like Mario, feels unfinished. The final third, with the absence of dungeons, sends Link on a tedious fetch quest, and changing the wind direction is an overlong and fussy process that always feels like a chore instead of a delight. This poor quality speaks to Nintendo's worry that Sony was leaving them behind, so they rushed these games through production, and the quality suffered. The most surprising game for the GameCube, which was originally designed for N64, was Animal Crossing. Now, the game is about a town, and at the start of it, you move into a house and are immediately put into debt by the house-providing raccoon Tom Nook. You make friends among the inhabitants, and the characters are simple archetypes, such as a jock boy or a fashion-conscious girl. But many layers are added to the personalities by ongoing interactions with them that shapes the town itself. The genius touch is that this works alongside the real world. As seasons pass, you observe holidays. The town's inhabitants form their own opinion of you over time. Now, it is not a traditionally structured game, therefore there is no real endpoint or success. Yes, you eventually pay off your debt, as seen here, but the only goals along the way are self-assigned. You decide what to do. Therefore, the appeal of Animal Crossing lies largely in being a good citizen and helping people while making friends. If this makes what is mundane somehow feel significant, with the virtual occupants coming to seem real. You can check in this instance like Hotel California, but you can never really check out. Equally surprising is Metroid Prime, released in 2002 by Retro Studios. They transplanted, in this instance, the key elements that made the 2D side-scroller successful into a 3D first-person adventure game. This focused on puzzle solving, exploration, and navigation in a large open-ended environment of Talon 4. Not necessarily in this particular game a first-person shooter. Nintendo was always wary of first-person games. Now the combat is handled through a lock-on that allows Samus to strafe around enemies, quickly dodging from side to side while under attack. Now, the scanning visor lets players examine key parts of the environment for clues and information, as seen here. When needed, of course, Samus can be switched to a third-person view and then back again, with the HUD or heads-up display designed to resemble the inside of Samus's helmet. We know this because whenever there are explosions nearby, you can even see her eyes illuminated in the glass. Now this adapts and transforms one of the most popular 2D templates into 3D. Now Nintendo was always wary of first-person games, but the stylistic transition was realized beautifully here in Metroid Prime. Turning to Rockstar, we know that the Grand Theft Auto series' tremendous success provided a series of developers the freedom needed to create high-quality games. One of those was Rockstar North and their Manhunt of 2003. In this example, we can say it's a reaction to the British tabloids rather than other first-person shooters or adventure games, and is deliberately nasty. Now, you play a death row inmate who's given a surprise second chance, and you are directed through levels by a disembodied voice. The main aim is to hide from and kill gang members through this escape. The violence is gratuitous, straight-faced exploration in this example of the agency, nature, and pleasure of video game violence, and this remains unique among games. Another example of a Rockstar game, this one coming from Rockstar Vancouver, is Bully of 2006. Now, this game combines an open-world mission structure with a boarding school setting. You play as Jimmy Hopkins, a bolshy young tough new to Bulworth Academy. The game then revolves around a day and night cycle. You attend lessons during the day, and it's played out through puzzles and mini-games, while you negotiate around various games in school and kiss the occasional girl or boy, whichever you choose. It is highly polished in its mechanics, with this bite-sized open world and mix of activities suited Bully's setting perfectly, and, in concert with one of Rockstar's better scripts, makes it an unknown gem. Now, turning to Halo again, we find that finally Halo 2, designed again by Bungie, delivers on the promise of Xbox Live. The online functionality that was made possible alongside this undercooked single-player campaign. The mechanics of Halo, in fact, are perfect for competitive online gaming, and this is matched by the outstanding map designs. Therefore, we find that Halo 2 dominated Xbox Live for years after its release, and there were still tens of thousands of players playing it when they took Xbox Live offline, thus a testament to the popularity of this title. Now, turning to the final game we will discuss, Clover Studios and their Okami of 2006 is arguably the greatest aesthetic achievement from Kamiya, and is a combination of the ancient religion of Shinto and traditional Japanese watercolor art. The cel-shaded visuals filtered through parchment provide this type of effect to create an overall impression of a moving painting. It is a stylistic triumph. Now, this ties into the core mechanic. At any point, the game can be frozen or paused, and it becomes a piece of sepia-tinted parchment, as seen in the lower left-hand corner. Objects can then be drawn in using the celestial brush. When unfrozen, they spring into existence. This is made possible because Amaterasu, the main character, is actually a Shinto sun goddess. She takes the form of a white wolf who's also mute. She does not talk. Therefore, the most amusing parts of the script are delivered by an inch-tall artist, Isun, who lives in her fur. It is a long and involved journey, and what makes it so remarkable is the visual invention that never lets up. It is beautifully realized in its aesthetic, which is the starting point for endless flourishes rather than a self-satisfying whole. Now, the PlayStation 2 era saw games find a broader audience, and at the same time a broader choice in subject matter and style. Therefore, the evolution was almost entirely due to Sony's success in having so wide a range of developers for their third party. Here we find that the games became both more sophisticated and simpler simultaneously. But Sony wouldn't be the company to capitalize on this expanded audience. We will discuss that next lecture. The most telling statistics at the end of this lecture should be that the GameCube ceased production in 2007, selling 21.74 million units. The Xbox ceased in 2008, selling over 24 million units. The PS2 finally continued up until 2013 with 155 million units sold. Thus, they have created the most successful console in history. Next class, we will turn to the history of handhelds and look at this bit of hardware and development.